clarification of Section 75 of the Government of Ireland Act led to political activity being geared towards influencing the British Parliament.
Well, yes, it was the Parliament was the prime focus of Connolly Association activity, because of course the British government and the Parliament made the laws, and pressure on the MPs could influence the British government and indirectly then impinge upon the six-county government and Parliament. And that was why over a period of time the convention was actually eroded. Of course this didn't really happen until the later 1960s, when pressure events forced the British government to intervene. But the criticism of the convention that matters devolved to the six counties couldn't be raised in Westminster continued right throughout the 60s, and was substantially eroded due to these Connolly Associations lobbying. And one thing worth mentioning in that context was the civil rights marches. The first civil rights marches were not in the north of Ireland; they were in fact in Britain, because of course marching was quite a popular radical pastime at that time in the context of the peace marches and the C&D marches and the Aldermaster marches. So Greaves got the idea, let's have marches on discrimination in the north of Ireland, and there were 3 marches organised, one from London to Birmingham, one from Liverpool to London, and one from Liverpool to Wakefield in Yorkshire, where over a period of a couple of weeks a few dozen Irish people and their supporters walked carrying banners about discrimination in the 6 counties, and the slogan "Ireland, one country" was carried at its head. And these were attempts to raise in the various towns along the way the issues of discrimination in the north of Ireland, and they got quite a bit of publicity in the local press in the towns along which the marchers went, and I was involved in 2 of them personally. And then the local radical movement, the C&D people, the peace people, the Labour people and so on, tended to get involved. And the unionists in the north of Ireland, the unionist administration, got quite upset about it, about this. And you sometimes make representations to the local media saying that these characters were not telling the truth about the 6 counties. And in fact everything was hunky-dory there, when in fact of course it wasn't.
Then you returned to Ireland, and Sean Redmond took over from you as General Secretary of the Association.
Yes, well, I've been organiser rather than General Secretary, but Sean became General Secretary in 1962, I think, and remained so throughout most of the 60s, and was the key person along with Desmond Greaves. They were full-time in the association. When I went back to Dublin and got a job as a university teacher, agreed to act as Dublin correspondent for the Irish Democrat, and I remained active in that capacity from 61-2 on until the Irish Democrat ceased publication way back in 40 years later in 2005. But the activity continued on the lines I mentioned, the lobbying of Parliament, the holding of marches, and of course the Connolly Association was not acting just in its own. Also, it was raising the issues of civil rights in the north of Ireland through the various organisations it was affiliated.
You were part of the fact-finding mission that was sent to the north to examine the whole issue of discrimination.
Yes, well, a number of people, there were several delegations actually to the 6 counties to try and find out the facts of the ground and publicise them in Britain, and I took part in one along with Desmond Greaves and Sean and Tom Redmond in 1962. And then the various facts and points we found out regarding discrimination we publicised in the marches I referred to, particularly in the one that was well over 250 miles from Liverpool to London. We walked every step of the way. So the association was a fount of information for the British Labour movement on discriminatory practices in the 6 counties. And later on, I think around 63-4, Mr. and Mrs. McCluskey set up the Campaign for Social Justice in Dungannon, which was one of the first elements of civil rights activity from the north, within the north itself. And in the early years, they provided much useful documentation on discrimination issues in the 6 counties, and there was very good relations between them and the association, and the various booklets and pamphlets which the McCluskeys produced under the Campaign for Social Justice were publicised and pushed around British labour and trade union circles by the association.
This was followed up with a deputation of Marcus Lipton MP and Betty Harrison of the Tobacco Workers Union and John Eber from the MCF on the occasion of the celebration of the Ulster Covenant.
Yes, 1962 was the 50th anniversary of the Covenant, and that was a kind of jamboree of ultra-unionist reaction at the time, and the association wanted to highlight that in British Labour circles. So this deputation went and they produced information, and there was a very nasty anti-Catholic leaflet I remember produced in some local area of Belfast by one of the unionist associations, which was very useful in anti-unionist propaganda in Britain at that time. So that's just another example of the lobbying which the association did, and the adverse publicity about the 6 counties which they were raising in Britain.
There were publications to spread the message.
Oh yes, the association originated a whole stream of pamphlets and documents about the North of Ireland. On the occasion of Wolfe Tone Bicentenary in 1963, Desmond Greaves produced a book on Wolfe Tone and the Irish Nation. Then there was another publication, The Irish Question and the British People. There were several editions of the basic pamphlet, The Irish Case Against Partition. There had been a pamphlet on the Mellon and Talbot trial I mentioned earlier. There was another pamphlet on Irish people make good trade unionists, because that was a theme to try and get Irish people to raise the Northern Question in trade union circles, and so on. A regular stream of publications paralleling the monthly Irish Democrat.
British organisations were persuaded to raise the whole issue of discrimination in the North.
Oh yes, the association was not on its own. It sought to influence other organisations. It was affiliated to the very important National Council for Civil Liberties, which was a long-established body in British circles, and it was also affiliated with the Movement for Colonial Freedom. And the late Sean Redmond, who was General Secretary during most of the 60s, was representing the association on the NCCL executive and on the MCF executive. And at the annual conference of these organisations, there were regularly resolutions and motions put down by the Connolly Association or by others relating to the discrimination issues in the North of Ireland. And of course these organisations were much more widely supported in Britain than the Connolly Association itself, so this kind of lever principle was important, that through other more politically well-known bodies the influence of the association was spread. And also several members of the association who were in the Labour Party were important in the setting up of the Campaign for Democracy in Ulster, which I think occurred in 1965, which was an important development within the Labour Party, and which resulted from the earlier activity of the association in lobbying that party.
In 1965, Belfast Trades Council called a conference on the whole issue of discrimination, but it led to nothing. What went wrong?
Well, of course, you must remember that Desmond Greaves had personal contact with quite a number of people in Belfast, as had other members of the association, both in the trade unions and through the Communist Party. And he was a personal friend of Betty Sinclair, who was both a CPI person and also Secretary of the Belfast Trades Council. And he also knew Dennis McCulloch, who was chairman of the Trades Council. And they of course, began to take an interest in the civil rights issues. And in '65, as a result of this kind of gradual development of awareness that civil rights was the Achilles heel of the unionist setup, the Trades Council agreed to sponsor a conference on discrimination and civil rights issues in the North. And this was held and quite well attended, and it was the first time ever, I suppose, in which some of the Republican representatives from Sinn Féin spelled out to their Protestant fellow nationals who were trade union delegates at that conference the situation they found themselves in, and there was a certain coming together and a receptive attitude by at least sections of the Belfast trade union movement to these anti-unionist messages. And this conference was well attended, and there was quite an optimistic air at it, I gather, and that something was going to be done. And the various delegates were then supposed to report back to their respective organisations and then come together again. But the Northern Ireland Labour Party, which was at the conference, and which of course was traditionally rather unionist in its outlook, failed to do anything. And that was why there was no immediate follow-up of that conference. And Desmond Greaves, in retrospect, thought that this was a lost opportunity, that it was a great pity that the civil rights movement didn't really get off the ground following this kind of this conference in Belfast, with the trade union element to the fore through the Belfast Trades Council and those other trade unions who were sympathetic to the civil rights issue. But in the next 2 or 3 years, 1955, 56, 65, 66 and 67, Paisley got more wind behind his sails. The ultra loyalist Orange element got more wind behind their sails. The Republicans and Nationalists got more frustrated that nothing was happening. Tinder began to pile up. You had, of course, the 66 5th anniversary of the 1916 Rising. There were a number of incidents which raised the temperature then. So that when the civil rights movement proper got going in 68, there was a rather different and more volatile political situation. Well, this is only a speculation that was a might have been, and that was a pity the civil rights activity in the North of Ireland didn't get going in a more organised fashion earlier on. Whether that, we can only speculate about that as a lost opportunity.
3 years later, the Wolfe Tone Society in Belfast took the initiative on discrimination, and the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Movement was founded.
Yes, it took the initiative on the nationalist and Republican side, but of course there were also elements from the trade union movement, the Belfast Trade Union movement, the Trades Council, Betty Sinclair, its secretary, and members of the Draftsmen's Union, particularly, who were involved in the shipyard, and who were generally on the left, some of them the CP, who also were involved in setting up the Civil Rights Association, which of course was officially founded in January '67. One must realise that all during the 60s there was a gradual growth of awareness in and knowledge about and concern about civil rights issues in all parties, you might say, in relation to the North. And but the Civil Rights Association proper got going in '67, and then in '68 you had the beginnings of the civil rights marches in the 6 counties proper.
Then there was the whole issue of the Bill of Rights.
Well, of course, in August '69 you had the pogroms or semi-pogroms in Belfast, in Ardoyne and so on, and the North became an issue of massive political and international interest, and the question was what should be done, and the demand began to come from some quarters that we need to abolish the Stormont Parliament and introduce direct rule. The first people to advance this demand were the ultra-left or far-left elements of the People's Democracy, and it was then taken up by the newly formed Provisional IRA after 1970, and eventually, of course, direct rule was imposed, as Desmond Greaves put it, by Edward Heath, like a cat being driven into a dairy. The Connolly Association said, we don't need direct rule from England. What is needed is a reformed situation in the 6 counties, where a straitjacket would be put on the Stormont Parliament to prevent Stormont abusing the situation, as it had been doing for decades, and encourage it to do positive things from a nationalist point of view. And that's why Greaves had the political genius, in my opinion, of bringing forward this particular notion of the Bill of Rights as a middle way between leaving things as they were, unreformed, with Stormont being able to do what it liked, which it had done for so long, and abolishing the Stormont Parliament completely and ruling the place directly from England. And that was the Bill of Rights conception, which would outlaw, which would be an act, a Parliament at Westminster outlawing discrimination in all sorts of areas in the 6 counties, at the same time encouraging North and South to come closer together over time, and which would thereby begin to tackle the constitutional side of the issue. And the Bill of Rights was advanced by the association. Greaves himself drafted a version of it, and it was put before the House of Commons and House of Lords in I think the year was 1972, but it was thrown out by the Labour Party. The Tories were then in office, and it didn't get through. But it was a middle way between leaving things unreformed and direct rule from London. Direct rule was, of course, imposed in due time, and you had it for 25 years, of course, until the reformed administration was put back in the 6 counties under the Good Friday Agreement.
What are the similarities between the Good Friday Agreement and the concept of a Bill of Rights?
Well, the most obvious similarity is that both take for granted that there will be some devolved administration in the 6 counties and a local assembly or local parliament within which the nationalists and unionists can work out their agreements and disagreements, because direct rule meant that everything was transferred to London, and there was no local assembly within which unionists and nationalists could interact. And of course that was established by the Good Friday Agreement, and the Bill of Rights took for granted that there would be such a parliament or local assembly. The important point being that that local assembly should be prevented from doing any nasty things from the point of view of discrimination and anti-Catholic behaviour, and be encouraged to do positive things. And of course the implicit proposal in the Good Friday Agreement and the explicit proposal in Desmond Greaves' Bill of Rights that the North and the South should be urged to should be facilitated in coming closer together by British policy. That's a common feature. So in some ways, I think there are remarkable parallelisms between these two political developments.
Before talking about Desmond Greaves, who were the other key people in the Connolly Association?
I was only involved way back in the late 50s, early 60s. The association had several hundred members and had a high level of activity, and some very highly qualified, committed and intelligent and politically highly educated people. I mean, I mentioned Sean and Tom Redmond already, but there were, of course, in the past, there were the likes of Joseph Deegan from Belfast, Pat Bond from County Longford, a number of outstanding women, the late Jane Tate and Tony Curran, were very active in the association. And in the more recent period, of course, there was still around. You had the likes of Charlie Cunningham, Tony Donaghy, Pat O'Donoghue, and so on. There were really several dozen people, all of whom were of considerable capacity, and some of whom wrote articles and were able to talk, speak at meetings, and so on. The association really had a very high level of involvement by a whole lot of people who were influenced by Greaves and others.
And how would you summarise Desmond Greaves?
Well, he was a remarkable individual, but of course politically I would say he was important for transmitting the Connolly view that the Labour movement, left-wingers, socialists and so on, should put the issue of national independence and national democracy to the fore of their political practice until national independence and national democracy was attained. And in that sense he passed on the Connolly tradition, which of course Connolly himself would regard as was a Marxist. He passed that tradition on to the modern Labour movement and the modern national movement in Ireland. The second point I think worth mentioning is that Greaves was more or less originated the idea of civil rights movement as the mechanism for shattering unionist predominance in the 6 counties. And practiced that, put that idea into practice in his political work in Britain. It was taken up later, of course, in the 6 counties, and there were other factors involved. But he originated that idea, which has proved, of course, to have destabilised unionism. And the third important influence, of course, was that he was one of the earliest critics of the common market development, the European integration proposal, which he saw as likely to make the whole issue of national independence the big issue in European politics generally for traditional imperial countries that had in the past caused national problems to others. So, as a theorist, as a political strategist, I think those would be his main contributions. And of course he also was a Labour historian who of course wrote those very important biographies, The Life and Times of James Connolly, which is still the definitive work on the subject, and his account of Leah Mellows of the Irish Revolution is of huge importance in relation to the dynamics of the War of Independence and the Civil War period. And then he had other studies, of course, the history of the Transformed General Workers' Union, which that union executive commissioned him to do, and the biography of Sean O'Casey and a number of other writings are still of influence to this day.